So I'll introduce this panel by telling two very quick stories that I think sort of illuminate, hopefully, this whole issue that we'll be talking about. And the first is a conversation I had with a bank president, with a former banking executive who had become basically the treasurer of his state. And, sorry?
Have the mic closer.
Oh, Mike Closer, who had become the Secretary of the Treasury of his state. And so he decided to have a meeting to get to know his staff, and he said, well, order everyone sandwiches, and let's sit down and have lunch. And his secretary said, oh, no, you can't have sandwiches. And he said, why not? And she said, well, you can only have sandwiches for overtime. And he said, but, I want to have a meeting with people, and it seems like lunchtime is a good time. We'll get everyone, friendly over food. She said, oh, no, sandwiches are for overtime. And so he tried to buy some sandwiches himself, and that ran into other various rules about doing things for the state, and then he ultimately gave up and just had a meeting, a brown bag lunch with his new staff. And then the second story is when I was writing a book on failure, I happened to interview a Danish small businessman who was in the process of going bankrupt, or not, because Denmark makes it very hard to go bankrupt. But in the United States, he would have gone bankrupt. In Denmark, he was sort of slowly strangling. But I was talking to him about the process of setting up his business. And he said, well, and then you have the health inspection and so forth. And I was at the building rapport. And so I just said the same thing I would say in any interview with an American small businessman. I said, oh, was that terrible? Because I don't care who you are. You could be a raging communist. You hate OSHA if you run a small business. And he said, no, the guy showed up. He flagged a few things. I don't want to work in an unsafe environment. I fixed them. It was no big deal. I have never heard this about occupational safety and licensing, and Denmark is different in that way. Their regulators are what we're really talking about here, which is principles-based rather than rule-based. Is that a vicious cycle, right? Do people hate government more because government is so terrible? And does hating government make it even worse? And so I see that as kind of the fundamental question that the last panel addressed, and hopefully that we will as well. We have an excellent panel. We have Jeremy Waldron, who is a university professor at the New York University School of Law, where he teaches legal and political philosophy. We have Bruce Homer, an associate professor and executive officer of educational psychology in the Learning, Development, and Instruction subprogram at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I got that all out in one sentence without stumbling. We have Francis Fukuyama, who many people will know from his book, The End of History. He's the Olivier Nomelini Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spolier Institute for International Studies. This is really a challenging workout for moderators here. Robin Lake, who is the director of the Center on Reinventing Public Education at the University of Washington. Paul Romer, who will actually be coming to us not via video, but on a phone call, who won the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics, he's a university professor at NYU as well, and the director of NYU's Marin Institute of Urban Management. And then we will have some people for the Q&A, but I will introduce them when that time comes. So we are going to start with Professor Waldron, if you would.
I'm going to speak from the pulpit.
Yes. We reverse things here because we're all about shaking things up. The moderator speaks from the pulpit. The participants will, the moderator sits down, the participants will speak from the pulpit.
All right. Good morning, and my compliments and greetings to Philip. Like Sally Katzen at the last panel, I'm going to be a bit of a skunk and a little bit of a devil's advocate, and I'm not sure whether it's appropriate to have that at the very beginning of the panel, but nevertheless, I'll try to lay down some challenges. In Philip's book, we have this wonderful, glowing proposal. This is about the third page of the introduction. Under this new governing philosophy, that's the set of proposals that Philip is setting out, people are empowered to take into account all the circumstances. Instead of uniformity, it encourages local differences. Instead of aspiring to avoid disagreement with clear rules set out in advance, it encourages argument over what's right. Instead of legal entitlements, it aspires to balance different interests. Instead of requiring objective proof, it allows people to make judgments based on their perceptions and their values. Instead of judging people by legalistic compliance, it judges them by the results they achieve and their good faith. Terrific vision, and it's fully articulated in the rest of the book. And one's inclined to say, who could possibly disagree with that? Who could possibly dissent? Why would anybody disagree? Here's why. And I'm going to mention 5 or 6 propositions that we need to think about. First of all, they're mostly about the issues that present themselves for regulation, the domains of questions, the domains of activity that present themselves for regulation. In many of them, in a country this size, populated by more than 250 million of highly opinionated, angry individuals, many of whom are on drugs, in a community of this size and a continent of this size and diversity, the solution to many of the problems that have to be dealt with is going to be counterintuitive. And just having people rely on common sense is going to be a problem because of the scale and technicality of what needs to be dealt with. You can't do air traffic control just based on common sense. To use another of Sally's examples, you can't do the safeguarding of the meat supply or the food supply generally just based on common sense. These are technical issues and they require great technical specification. So any solution that we propose has to meet that challenge of counterintuitive technical modes of decision. And even in the areas where there are intuitions, and intuitions are relevant at various stages in dealing with the issues that we face, we know that people's intuitions differ. I've spent a lot of my career writing about disagreement. I had a book called Law and Disagreement, trying to convey to my colleagues that when they talk about justice, they're talking about an area where people disagree about justice. Disagree as a matter of principle, not just disagreeing as a matter of interest, although both types of divergence are tremendously important. People disagree about values and priorities, so that your common sense is not necessarily my common sense. Now, Philip doesn't disagree with that. He says we have to argue this out, and people have to be willing to take responsibility for acting on their own values and priorities. But we do have to understand that people bring multiple values and principles to the decisions that their society faces, and that people are stakeholders of multiple kinds come to the issues that the society faces. When Nicole Gelinas spoke about opposition to pedestrianization, she talked about it as bureaucratic opposition, but in the next breath she explained that this was the opposition of multiple stakeholders, drivers, businesses, and so on. That wasn't bureaucratic opposition, that was an attempt to try to find a way to integrate these multiple arrays of stakeholders. And some stakeholders in their protests and their objections and their proposals are more legitimate than others. And again, that's a matter of an assessment of the kinds of stakeholders we're dealing with. So any decent decisional process has to deal with that, and simply saying, well, someone must take responsibility won't be enough. Many of the issues that need to be faced are complex, and we're talking really, really complex. The complexity that requires articulation, that is the breaking down of a given decision into 100 or 1,000 component decisions with input from 100 or 1,000 different directions. And don't just think of the small cog in the machine type bureaucrat, but we need one group of scientists to work on this aspect. And we need another group of scientists, specialists, so not the first group, to work on the other impact. And their results, their decisions about the supervision of a food supply chain or the management of a large river, those scientific inputs need to be brought into relation with one another. That's why God invented process. Yeah? We break a decision down step by step into its component parts, and we require some mechanism, decisional mechanism, that brings one set of decisions into another set of decisions. We need, in the midst of all this, predictability, calculability of results. When Weber spoke about the advantages of bureaucracy, it was calculability above all that he had in mind, and that's sometimes related to the use of rules rather than standards. We use rules rather than standards and principles when we are less worried by the mistakes of over and under inclusiveness with rules than we are worried by the mistakes of judgment and discretion in the case of standards. But somebody has to make that decision. And even if we are using standards and principles, we have to find processes that will relate one set of standards and principles to another set of standards and principles, because these are very, very seldom decisions that can simply be made in a Solomonic fashion of cutting through all the detail. Because people disagree, and because this is a large, large country, a decision made about one bridge or about one form of lettuce in the food supply chain will be repeated all over the country, and necessarily there will be different common senses at work on that. And we face issues about impartiality and even-handedness that need to be addressed and can only be addressed, I think, by something like a bureaucratically organized apparatus. You see what I'm trying to do? It's not just small people taking micro decisions, it's people taking component decisions and relating those into some predictable array. And then finally, we have to consider the temptations associated with the model that Philip has in mind. The wonderful marquee example he uses is the elevation of the deck of the Bayonne Bridge and the ludicrous requirement that there be an environmental impact report on that. He says, why did you need 5-year environmental study when the environmental impact was minimal or close to minimal? Yeah, sure. Why? But the next construction problem comes along and there's a slightly higher possibility of environmental impact, but somebody will want to take advantage of that first exemption, pressure the person who was empowered to make the exemption and to cut through or dismiss the need for an environmental impact. There will be firms and businesses who will set up offices whose job it is to lobby for this sort of assessment, and eventually somebody is going to have to take responsibility for determining, presumably on objective grounds and presumably on complex grounds, when such waivers are possible. So you just land yourself with a different kind of bureaucratic process. I'm not with Sally Katz, and I don't want to get rid of the notion of bureaucracy. I want us to embrace a vision of bureaucracy that involves the integration of the multiple steps and decision points in a rational process that deals with counterintuitive technical problems. Thank you very much indeed.
Professor Homer?
All right. I'm a psychologist, so I can't talk without visual aids. It's impossible. So you have to apologize. I'll apologize for having some slides here. And this is going to be completely different because I'm just trying to give you a little background on some basic cognitive psychology that might be relevant to the discussion going on today. I'm going to talk about the human cognitive architecture and how that might be relevant to cutting through the bureaucracy and complexity of the rules. This is kind of a model that's of how we process information. It's obviously a gloss. It gets more complex the deeper you get into it, especially when you start trying to relate it to neurocognitive substrates. But it's a handy heuristic for how we process information. Initially, information comes in, we hold it in our sense memory, which is just auditory, visual stimuli coming in. It's there briefly for like 3 to 7, like a half a second to 3 seconds, and then we forget about 90% of it, which is a good thing because otherwise you'd go crazy. So once it's in sense memory, we somehow attend to certain things depending on our current state of affairs, our objectives, our goals, prior experiences. We select some information from our sensory input to enter into working memory. This is where like a lot of the action of thinking takes place. So in working memory, this is Miller's famous 7 plus or minus 2. We can hold about 7 units of information. What a unit is depends on what you know. So if you're a young kid learning to read, a unit might be letters. If you're older, an experienced reader, a unit might actually be phrases or concepts. But you can hold about 7 pieces of information. It stays in working memory for just a brief time, but we have techniques we use to keep stuff in working memory if we're trying to work with it. So rehearsal, those of us who are old enough to have had to look up phone numbers in a phone book and go dial it on a phone. I'm aging myself there. You'd look up in the phone book and say, okay, 506, 575, 2525, and say that as you're walking, which is my parents' old number. So that's rehearsal. We keep stuff in mind. We also can bring stuff in from long-term memory into working memory to process. Key thing is working memory is very limited. Long-term memory is practically infinite, but the key is to find the proper retrieval cues to bring stuff from long-term memory into working memory so we can process and integrate what we're learning right now. And that's a phenomena that, again, as I get older, I say, I know the name of that researcher, what is that? And I have to try to say, okay, well, they worked out on the East Coast, and and then, oh yeah, it was so-and-so. So it takes a while to retrieve it and bring it into working memory. So I want to explore this working memory. As I said, that's where a lot of the important stuff takes place. This is John Sweller came up with this model talking about cognitive load. And his point is, since working memory is a limited capacity, you have to think about how you're filling it up. And in any kind of learning process, you have intrinsic load. That's just how complex something is. So if you're teaching kids mathematics, addition is going to be less complex than if you're teaching them multiplication. So there's a certain inherent complexity to any new information being learned. There's extraneous load. There's certain cognitive resources that are needed just to process information. If decoding text, listening to a speaker, if the speaker's kind of mumbling and not talking clearly, then it's a higher cognitive load. It's harder to process that information. So that's extraneous load. Germane load is the effort you're making to actually learn it, integrate it into long-term information, and then hopefully you have a little bit of free memory left to process and think and be creative. I study learning, so we use this model to design learning materials and thinking about we don't want to increase too much the extraneous load and then the students can't learn. One of the things I do is build video games for learning. And part of the problem there is often people put so much effort into the game that they forget about the learning content. And if the kids are focusing too much on playing the game, then they're not going to be having enough cognitive space left to actually learn the content we're trying to teach. All right, so as I said, the extraneous load is the non-essential information. And if I'm thinking about stuff we talked about today with bureaucracy, laws, regulations, if you have a very complex written text that, is more bureaucratic and not as clearly written as need be, you're going to be taking up resources, cognitive resources, to process the content of that information needlessly. So that would be extraneous load. If you have super complex laws and regulations, maybe it's written clearly, but it's so complex that it takes so much resources that you can't, you're overloading your cognitive resources just trying to process these complex rules and regulations, and that can be overloading and not leave room for creativity and thinking. And that's that little free spot there at the end. You need some room left over in your working memory to think, to brainstorm, to come up with new ideas, to remember past solutions, to imagine what possible creative solutions might be. And if you're overloading either from extraneous or intrinsic load, then you're not going to have the resources to be creative, to think. And that's it. There. Leave it on that one. Just a couple of last parting thoughts. Part of what we do in our research is think about ways to enhance working memory. One of the ways we do this is through emotions. So we design materials that induce positive emotions, and this actually increases the working memory that students have. They can learn better. Conversely, if you're kind of upsetting people, then it contracts their working memory. They have less resources cognitive resources to put towards a task. They are less creative in solving solutions. So again, thinking about the frustrations of being surrounded by rules and regulations that feel constricting, you can imagine that induces negative emotions, and then you can get this sort of negative feedback loop going. So that's one of the concerns, sort of from my perspective. And finally, I'm in education, so the talk today just kind of reminded me of something that my advisor, David Olson, wrote about 10 years ago, about the need to sort of, he didn't call it deregulating, but he's reducing some of the restrictions within education. And he talked about it in terms of rights and responsibilities, starting with the student. The student has a right to have access to material to learn, but has a responsibility for learning. The student has to be responsible for themselves. The teacher, on the same token, should have the rights to have access to all the resources they need to teach the student and set up a proper environment for the student to learn, and so on, all the way up the bureaucratic ladder. So it's really empowering each person in that whole structure to do what they're doing, whether it's learning, teaching, providing resources to learn. And so I think that's an analogous from my world to yours. So thank you.
All right, we now have Professor Fukuyama, who is,
Can you?
wait. Not sure what's, okay, Professor Fukuyama, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me? All right.
Yes, thank you.
All right, good. So thank you very much. Congratulations to Philip on his book. I agree that reform of the American public sector is a really key priority right now. And I basically agree with the basic proposal, which I would state in a slightly different form than he does, perhaps. There are too many rules in the way that we govern the country. Those rules need to be replaced by what he calls common sense. That is to say, government officials need to use their own human judgment to make various complex trade-offs and not try to do it through a prior ex-ante specification of outcomes. And at the same time, we need a system of greater accountability. Now, what he's basically talking about is increasing the amount of administrative discretion in American government in the executive branch. Now, if you use the word administrative discretion rather than common sense, all of a sudden that becomes pretty controversial, and in particular, a lot of conservatives will get their backs up. But I think we have to understand that that's essentially what it means. This has been done in other countries. So, for example, under new public management in the 1990s, a lot of Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, essentially made that trade-off. So, for example, the central bank governor in Australia has a contract. It sets performance criteria like what the maximum inflation rate is, and if he hits that, he gets renewed, and if he doesn't, he doesn't get renewed. But the contract doesn't specify in any detail how you're supposed to get to those objectives. And I think there's basically, a lot of empirical literature at this point. Daniel Carpenter, Peter Evans, Daniel Honig, that suggests that actually a sufficient degree of bureaucratic autonomy is actually the key to a high-performing public sector. So the basic proposal, I think, is absolutely right. However, I would make several caveats to that generalization, which then make it much more harder to apply in an American context. First caveat has to do with state capacity. A grant of autonomy to an executive branch agency is only possible, I think, under conditions of high capacity. If you provide more autonomy to low capacity bureaucrats, that is to say, people with poor training and background, I think what you're going to get is more incompetence and basically more corruption. I would say, by contrast, high-performing bureaucracies in the American government already exercise a lot of autonomy. So you think about, what are the high-capacity agencies, things like the Centers for Disease Control, NASA, the military, the U.S. military at an operations level, the staff of the Federal Reserve. These are, for the most part, staffed by PhD, level people. Congress doesn't attempt to give them any kind of detailed instructions on how to, set interest rates or put a man on the moon or conduct a complex military operation. And so they, in fact, have a lot of autonomy. The problem lies in lower level, and especially the kind of street level bureaucrats that don't have the training and education. And there, I think, autonomy becomes, quite problematic. So you consider, would you want a poorly, educated TSA person to make discretionary judgments on who looks like a terrorist, as opposed to the system in Israel where they train people to, at a very high level to try to detect who is a suspicious person coming through their airports, right? So this grant of autonomy really does depend on having the right personnel to execute it. Second larger problem I've got is I don't like this bureaucracy versus democracy because the valence is wrong. I mean, it puts all of the blame on the bureaucrats themselves. In my opinion, the bureaucratic problems in our country are almost entirely the fault of Congress and by extension of the American people themselves. One of the most enduring characteristics of American political culture is distrust of executive authority. I think we carry this to a pathological level, and it leads us into a low-level equilibrium where we distrust the bureaucracy, therefore we don't want to fund it properly, and we don't want to give it sufficient authority, and that, somehow leads to poor performance. And then people say, oh, look, the bureaucracy isn't doing well, why should we give it more authority and more resources? If you contrast that to countries like, let's say, Britain or France or Germany or Japan that have very high-quality bureaucracies, they're in a high-level equilibrium in which they grant, bureaucracies sufficient authority and resources. They do well, and people say, yeah, that's good. The government is really competent. I think another problem, that lies on the congressional democratic side rather than the bureaucratic side has to do with the mandates that create bureaucracies, and that's where I think a lot of the rules come from. Congress simply issues very poor mandates when they create federal agencies. They're often excessively complex and they are contradictory oftentimes. You take the example of Dodd-Frank, the bill itself is hundreds of pages long, and then the enabling legislation, it's not the bureaucrats that wanted to do that, that's in the statute itself that mandated that the bureaucrats continue to write further rules. The reason is Congress basically doesn't want to either grant sufficient authority so that they don't have to write the rules because they don't trust, the outcomes, or they hope that if there are problems, it'll all be sorted out later by the courts. I think that the public sector, any kind of real reform along the lines that Philip is suggesting is hindered by the basic problem of public distrust of bureaucrats and bureaucracies. And this, it's not even 8 o'clock in the morning, so I wasn't on for the first panel. But Paul Light, has written, especially his most recent book, extensively about this. We don't trust bureaucrats, therefore we put a cap on the total number of federal bureaucrats that actually was set back in the 1960s. So we don't have, many more bureaucrats than we did back then. Meanwhile, the size of the amount of resources funneled through the bureaucracy has increased by 5-fold, and we deal with that by outsourcing, by hiring contractors. I think that, this is really the result of a political culture that just doesn't, it wants to pretend that we're putting caps on government when all we're doing is capping our own ability to do the functions of government. I think that what Phil calls correctness is also characteristic of the American people themselves. If you have a polarized situation in which the two parties are looking for political ammunition against one another, you're going to call out the government on very small issues that really should, be allowed to slide because sometimes people make mistakes, but that's a problem. That's the problem in military procurement. For example, the Federal Acquisitions Regulation want to make sure that every single contingency is covered because you don't want a scandal in procurement, and that doesn't happen in the private sector. I will conclude just by the following. I'm not sure that we can fix the problem right now because of polarization. I just don't think the conditions are right for a big public sector reform because there is too much underlying, the political level is not, there's not consensus. So, Phil, for example, Philip talks about seeking the common good. It's kind of like the old progressive era mantra that we need, impersonal expertise that can look at public interest. But right now, I don't think we agree on what public interest is. If you look at environmental regulation, there are lobbyists on both sides that will tell you where that trade-off between economic growth and environmental protection ought to be, and there's simply not, a clear point at which a disinterested public official would have the authority to make that kind of judgment. So my 8 minutes are up, so thanks very much. Look forward to the rest of the panel.
Okay, Professor Lake.
Great. Thanks for having me. I hope everybody can hear me all right.
Yes.
So I can't be there myself. But so my job is to talk about how bureaucracy plays out in public education. And Professor Romer started to set that up for us. And so I'll just kind of continue on that line. One of the greatest ironies and toughest dynamics in my work is trying to explain to policymakers and researchers and everybody else why the rules and regulations that were really created with good intentions to protect students and adult interests actually end up creating a public education system that becomes hostile to innovation and improvement, and actually, in a lot of ways, ends up hurting the kids who most need our support and help. So the work of our center and what I've spent my career working on is trying to create that space for innovation and improvement while still maintaining the public of public education. I think a lot of the comments sort of get to, like, this is about the balance. This is not about a dichotomy, really. And the other challenge that we run into is that when it comes to kind of finding the solutions and the path forward for creating that space, it's not a question of just removing 1 or 10 policies or regulations that get in the way. It's really death by 1,000 cuts. It is really the accumulation of well-intentioned agreements and log-rolled political dynamics and processes that end up doing 4 very damaging things. And I'll stick to 4 because I don't want to overwhelm your cognitive load. First, they divide schools. So schools don't function as real organizations. Second, they muddy accountability. Third, they deaden innovation. And fourth, they end up hardwiring inequality into the system. So those are the things that I want to talk about with you, and let me just dig into each of them a little bit. First, on dividing schools. What we know makes for the most effective schools, especially those that are what you might think of as beating the odds, getting better results for kids who are historically disadvantaged, is they are functional, strategic, focused organizations. Everybody in the building is rowing in the same direction. The reality in most school districts is that schools aren't treated that way. They're treated as recipients of sort of a random assortment of students and staff and families that are thrown together in a building and really asked to make the best of it, all while they're working under their own set of rules supported by different outside entities. And so you get this sort of mess of dynamics that Richard Elmore has called this loosely coupled system, where folks are working and trying to move in a focused direction, but the difficulty of reaching agreement on direction and sustaining that collaboration over time, is pretty overwhelming, and always you encounter a situation where somebody can be a holdout. Somebody could put a stop to a focused direction and kind of dig in their heels, and it can come from just about any direction. So that's the division. Let's focus on the kind of muddied accountability question. The most common answer I get when I ask schools or central offices in districts who's accountable for something, the most common response I get is, well, we all are. And really what that means in practice is that nobody is accountable. When everybody's accountable, nobody is accountable. Everybody feels some level of responsibility, but it's very difficult to assign a dynamic to really who is responsible if something goes wrong. You can also ask them, well, what are you accountable for? And there we get pretty quickly into process and compliance crowding out outcomes. There's been a big movement over the past 10, 20 years to get schools to focus on outcomes, but in reality, the more things that are shoved down from above and that really are performance or, compliance oriented, especially when it comes to very important questions like special education, there's always a reason to not focus on the outcomes and to instead focus on the thing that's right in front of you. So we get a situation where, if you're a parent without agency in particular, if you can't manage the political process, you get what I think of as the blank stare of bureaucracy when something is going wrong for your student. That can be a pretty maddening experience for families. Let's move to deadening innovation. You can always find examples of innovation in our public schools, and usually it's a very isolated instance. It can be tracked back to kind of a mad dog principal who's willing to thwart the rules. And that's very much because we've created a situation where educators have to ask for permission to innovate or break the rules. And just to give you an example of a Seattle school that I visited, the principal was really trying to solve a problem that was causing a lot of parents to leave the school. Kids weren't being challenged at every different level. I suggested that she look at a charter school that had developed a coherent school design to address that problem. And she sort of sat back in her chair and sighed and went through the process of people and programs that she'd have to go to get people to sign off on this, including the school board, getting her own teachers on board, getting families on board. So managing that coherent sort of task of innovation becomes a very, very difficult thing when you add on procurement rules and all the things that kind of create barriers to entry for new people who are oriented around problem solving. It gets pretty overwhelming. We often find kind of a learned helplessness in our schools because of that sort of disincentive for innovation. And then finally on the hardwiring inequality, this one's kind of hard to explain quickly, but the set of accumulated rules in our public schools create fundamental disconnects between money, student needs, and staffing. They're all disconnected and they're all flowing to schools in pretty random ways. And what you end up getting are pretty perverse realities like, and this is the deadliest, the newest, least qualified educators in schools are working with the neediest students. So that's how inequality is kind of hardwired into the system. Our work is really to kind of, think about shifting these four dynamics and making things better. But that is no easy task, as you all know. Every rule is there because it was settled by a past fight, or was a priority of the last majority. So those are very hard things to unwind piece by piece. And you've got, two pretty powerful bureaucracies in public schools, central offices and unions that end up fighting each other as much as anybody else.
I have to cut you off there. You've hit your 8 minutes. And we are running over time, but thank you very much, Professor. And our last guest is Paul Romer of NYU, who is actually coming to us by phone because I guess something's wrong with the video. So, are you there, Professor Romer?
So, Megan, can you hear me?
I absolutely can. Can you hear me? Good.
Wonderful. Okay. Yeah. God, sometimes it works. I'm the guy who's always saying how great technology is, and it usually fails me. But I wish I could be there today. Glad to at least be here virtually. I think these are very important questions. Let me start by describing the way that Philip changed how I think about these issues. And I'm not sure he would endorse the version that I took away from conversations with him, but whether or not he does, here's what I think. I grew up and just took for granted this kind of mantra that we wanted what we called rule of law instead of rule of man. And it's probably okay to call it rule of man still, because when people say that, they want to say it's bad. But, it's really rule of people. In economics, we sometimes refer to this as rules versus discretion. We want everybody to follow rules, not have discretion. Phil persuaded me that that's just fundamentally wrong to think that that's the right way to aim, is to have less discretion, less decision-making by people. And in its place, I think the word that I like is the notion of responsibility and responsible. What we have to do is ask people to be responsible for some set of decisions. That means they make those decisions based on what they see. Then, after some period of time, you look back and you see what the consequences were from the decisions that somebody made, and then you hold them responsible by saying, look, you didn't do as well as we'd hoped. We're going to, pay you less, or we're going to have somebody else take over the job. But I think this idea of relying on individuals who are responsible for decisions, it's really all we've got. Any system that somebody tries to describe where they say, oh, well, this is operating according to rules, it's always kind of like the joke, it's always people all the way down. People are the ones who implement the rules. They design the rules. They check on compliance. And so this idea that somehow we can just take people who make decisions out of the system it's really kind of absurd. And so I think if we just give up on this idea of this kind of mechanical, or almost like a computer code-based notion of rule of law, and stick with the fact that we want to give people responsibility, let them make decisions, and then hold them responsible, I think that's the only way to move forward. The conversation so far has, I think, raised a couple of interesting questions. I mean, one is, why is the United States a bit of an outlier compared to other countries? So I think Megan alluded to this in her note about the guy in Denmark. I think Francis also noted this unusual U.S. kind of opposition to executive authority. I want to come back and say something about why I think the U.S. is unusual, but I think it's also an important question to ask, why is an outcome, even given the U.S. characteristics, why is it an outcome that OSHA persists the way it does? As Megan said, everybody hates OSHA. If you read what rules OSHA writes, they're really absurd. It can't possibly be the case that people who work at OSHA are happy about this equilibrium. But then why does that persist? So before I get to those, let me just try and step back and do my economist thing. The fundamental challenge here is to go back and forth between individuals and groups. There's this duality between thinking about how things look to an individual versus how they look to the group as a whole. Most of economics is about the tension between these two perspectives and learning to think in both ways. Think like the individual, think like the market, think like the outcome, think like the equilibrium. I think a good example for this purpose would be something like the use of timing rights that limit the rate at which cars can go onto the highway. The individual level perspective is, well, this is really stupid. They're saying that they're trying to help us get home or get where we want to go faster, and to do that, they're making us just sit here and wait. What a dumb thing to do. But yet, of course, if you understand traffic and look at the system as a whole, on average, people get where they're trying to go faster if you actually meter the rate at which cars can enter onto the highway. So there's inevitably a tension between what the individual sees versus what somebody who's thinking about the group level sees. There's a problem with trying to help people understand that and recognize that sometimes their individual kind of reaction, that this is stupid, this is a constraint, why do I have to do this, is a sign that they aren't seeing the whole picture. But the question is, how do you put in place a system that acts on behalf of the group and gets the things we want, like better throughput on highways. Now, I think there's a good book called Freedom and Fairness that compares the United States with New Zealand and notes the historical fact that the United States got settled at a time when religious freedom was the big concern. So I think we are unusual in the book documents this, and our rhetoric and our beliefs about freedom is really good. So implicitly this suggests that individuals should always be able to do what seems right to them. In New Zealand and many other kind of colonies settled at the same time by British people who left Britain, New Zealand was settled at a time when fairness was a bigger concern, like equality, economic opportunity. And so the United States has, over the centuries, maintained this notion of a celebration of freedom, and therefore this opposition to executive authority. And I think that's what makes us distinctive. Now, another piece of evidence that's interesting, and this is not just the one that Megan said it about, are people okay with facing some regulations, but also think about something like compensation. In Singapore, a government official can get a salary that's more than $1 million US per year, and that doesn't even count the bonus that they can get, which could even double that. So if you agree that you want some people to make decisions and be responsible, it's not such a strange thing to say, well, maybe we should attract good people, and then to say, maybe we should pay them, very well because we really want to attract good people. But that's just such a foreign concept in the U.S. that you get laughed out of the room if you proposed something like this. The thing, so we ended up with, we don't think of compensating people well, we don't think of trying to attract good people to these executive type decision-making roles, and we rely a lot on the courts. We think that the courts are the way we keep bad people from doing bad things if they have some discretion. And the OSHA equilibrium is one which I think is dominated by, can I enforce a fine in a court? Can I make it stick? And the firms are trying to figure out, is there a way I can evade the legal punishment through the legal system? This alternative where you think about having people who are responsible and that have some independent ability to collect information and decide what's the right thing to do in that case. That's a system which actually works in the United States and other parts of the regulatory world. I think FAA regulation is a lot more like this system of responsibility than the OSHA type regulation. And it's partly because FAA inspectors have quite a bit of power to do things that's, at least until now, not been subject to much judicial oversight and review.
Professor Romer, I am so sorry. I am going to have to cut you off because I've been deputized to become a martinet. Oh wait, give him. I'm getting a signal. Yeah. No, I'm getting a signal at the back of the room to give you another couple minutes to wrap up.
I think. By the way, this is sticking to the time is one of these rules that you have to.
Yes, I know. It's.
Yeah. And it's no fun. It's no fun to be the person who has to be responsible. But you're responsible for the time.
I'm a huge fan of your work.
No, but I think that really tees up the problem, which is we can see alternative systems. There's a real question: how could the U.S. get from where we are right now towards systems that work better? But at least it's good to have an idea of what might be a system that works better. Thanks.
Okay. Well, we thank you to all of our panelists. We have time for a very brief Q&A, since I'm going to try to end this panel on time. And we have coming up to join us two new panelists. We have, sorry, I've got this all lined. We have Ned Phelps, 2006 Nobel Prize winner, and we have Professor Robb from Columbia, both economists. So we are going to be doing a very economics-heavy Q&A. And we now have a huge Q&A group here. So I'm just going to ask one question and ask the group to kind of address this. And I will do a very short preface, which is that, I've noticed something among Trump supporters where you say, when people talk about the rule of law, they don't care. And it's not that they don't get what people are talking about. What they feel is that we, the people in this room and the people in New York and in Washington, we write the rules. And in that sort of Anatole France, the law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges and to beg bread. This sense that like the rules themselves are no longer legitimate when they get to a certain point, and the flip side, that the people who write them, the people like the law professors, we are good at twisting the rules. We are good at hiring lawyers to get through the bureaucracy. It is the people who are less privileged who are outside of these circles. So I'm going to throw that out to the group. Does having too much process undercut the legitimacy of process? Not merely slow us down and make us inefficient, but does it make democracy work less well, which I think is really the core question of the book. Not in any given bureaucracy does it like make things a little less efficient, but does it actually undermine our ability to build a society in which things can happen? And I'll start with the defender here, with the devil's advocate.
So it depends who the rules are being written for, whether they're being written primarily for individuals who will self-apply them to their own circumstances, or to corporations or businesses. Because one thing we haven't touched upon is that corporations evolve bureaucracies of their own to match the bureaucracies that they are faced with from the state. And we have to consider the way in which compliance officers, human resources officers, impact officers within corporations can take on, internalize rules and develop strategies for dealing with them. I had wanted to ask Bruce, should we be trying to match the models of cognition and memory for individual humans that were put up on the screen with the models of memory, institutional memory and institutional cognition for organizations? Because that's what we are talking about, is institutional cognition. And sometimes the rules that sound absurd when they're discussed in a setting like this make much more sense when they're being addressed to a large mechanism that will then develop strategies for dealing with.
Well, I think we actually have two people who have given slightly different answers to that, so I'm going to throw that to them. We have Professor Homer and then Professor Romer, with nice alliteration, who actually I think came out somewhat on opposite sides of that. So if I could ask each of you to do a very brief, 1 minute response to that question.
Sure. I think it's a really interesting point. And one of the things I didn't get into is that we have limits of working memory, but we've also have built lots of tools to overcome those, including books and archives, and I study technology. But yeah, so it's really intriguing. The idea to think, yes, let's try to, we still have limits to our capacity to process all this information, but it comes back to retrieval, I think, and that's the whole point you're making. So let's find these good cues to retrieve them, reduce the sort of burden of having to think about the outcomes we want, and if we can make the institutional and individual mesh, that would be fantastic.
Professor Romer. Are you still there?
Yeah. So first, I think we should pay attention to people who are saying, this legalistic system is broken, even if they're people who are, otherwise not being completely coherent or just being emotional. I think for two reasons. One, you alluded to, Megan, which is that you can, the whole system functions only if law and judicial decisions have legitimacy. And legitimacy is something that's got to be earned by the system. So if you're getting bad outcomes and inefficient processes, you lose legitimacy, the whole system is going to collapse. But even with a system that's legitimate, one could still say, we're just relying way too heavily on, say, judicial review and not enough on individuals who are responsible for making good decisions. And so I think we may be facing both problems. We're at risk of losing the legitimacy of the system of judicial checks on behavior, but we're probably relying on it too much, and we really should explore where can we delegate executive authority and responsibility and open up, at least especially in the U.S., open up more opportunities for that to function.
And I'm going to throw this out to our economists who've arrived, and you were probably aware that this sort of mirrors the question of Adam Smith's the man of system, right, versus the man of print. Like, can we fix this, and how bad is the impact that this has on systems?
I think legitimacy is the right thing to be focusing on. And what to do when you've sunk into a bad equilibrium, or a low-level equilibrium, as Professor Fukuyama called it. On October 31st of 2017, the Center on Capitalism and Society had another remarkable conference. It was called The Age of the Individual. It was 500 years ago today. And we commemorated a moment in time when the Catholic Church had become impossibly complex and corrupt, and every attempt to reform it had been tried and failed. And along came a revolution when Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door, translated the Bible into the vernacular, and set up independent church. That was a revolution in thinking about what to do about religion in the West. Then in the late 19th century, a revolution, what to do about government. The Continental Congress has a Declaration of Independence, you storm the Bastille, and like all revolutions, it leads to themes of emancipation, individualism. And Philip used the word revolution at the beginning of his remarks today. I've heard him use the word in the past. Sometimes I worry we're all going to get arrested, and going to have to ask Nicole to keep us out of the New York Post. But so I guess I'd turn it into a question to Philip. How do we have a revolution where you sweep things clean because the equilibrium is stable and gradual adjustments don't work? I think that's the question that we need to address, and I think the word revolution is interesting. I don't, it's always a messy thing, and I don't know. I don't have the answer. Maybe Philip does.
And does anyone else want to comment on this line of discussion, or we have 7 minutes to? Yes.
Yeah. I don't think although I'm an economist, I don't think I'm a person who's qualified to figure out how to realize Philip's dream. I'm not that good an economist. But I would like to say something that I haven't heard here this morning. I have a perspective that is, I think, in Philip's book, explicitly, I think, here and there, but it's not generally emphasized. I'm referring to the importance to people of the experience of imagining something different, something new, and the experience of exercising one's creativity. So my recent work could be seen as a celebration of the thrills and delights brought about by that sort of life, and that sort of careers and so forth. I'm more interested in the number of smiles on people's faces than the number of dollars that they earn. So from this perspective, I think one would like to see a relaxation of regulations where that would be exhilarating for the bureaucrats and where it would also be of benefit to those being regulated. So maybe we should be proceeding in a gradual way of trying to think about the needs of bureaucrats to express themselves, rather than taking the view that bureaucrats ought to use their judgment. That's what we're paying them for.
I think that's actually a really important point, and I was a little surprised on the earlier panel because the bureaucrats I know, the people who work in civil service, they hate it. They hate this feeling that they're not allowed to do anything, that everything is so bound about by rules that, you know, the flip side of the conservative complaint about government not working, which is correct, is that you then also have to say, well, but you have to give them the power to work. You can't just, you have to pay them enough to get good bureaucrats from the private sector, as we've heard. And you also have to give them the freedom to actually do something. So that I'm going to turn to Professor Lake and ask her to comment, since that's right on point. Oh, sorry.
This is Paul. I had one question back for Ned. I could ask later or now if
please go ahead. We have a minute.
Well, let me just say, Ned, there's this real value survey that looks at general trends. So I was kind of saying the U.S. has got this problem because of our history, but there may be a general trend here which is worrisome. Those trends can be interpreted as trends towards much more value on agency, individual freedom, creativity, and I always thought of those from the perspective of innovation as being good trends. I'm now starting to worry that there's a downside to this, that if this kind of individualism turns into narcissism, you lose the capacity for anybody to say, well, yeah, it really seems to me like I shouldn't have to wait for this timing light, but, somebody who knows what they're doing has made the decision here. We may get to this kind of narcissism of the individual that means that we lose the capacity to make collective decisions that are useful. So I used to be on the same page you were. I'm now a little bit more worried.
Do you have a response to that, or is
I'm disappointed, but no comment.
Okay, Professor Lake, can you talk about how this works out on the ground level? This constraint.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing in public education is a great experiment in a lot of different approaches and trials, and we're learning a lot, right? So, we're learning how much autonomy is enough and under what circumstances, and how government can transform away from policies that are oriented around directives and taking away agency, and instead around regulatory strategies focused on outcomes. And that's the work. And I think, to the point around do bureaucrats want to innovate, and can they? We're seeing that a lot of school districts that take on the question of autonomy and take it seriously are finding that there are people who were kind of tamped down and about to leave, who find a new life in the bureaucracy because they've been given space to innovate and do things. And that they can, to Professor Fukuyama's point, when government agencies kind of develop these capacities, they can create a spectrum of opportunities for folks that fit their abilities. So this is, and bottom line is, there's not one path, but I think it's the work, and that's where the research and development comes in.
So I want to pick up with a very short question that we will not have time to get everyone to answer. But, one thing that struck me when reading the book and also listening to people talk, it's come up a couple of times, is liability, right? Is how much of this activity is actually structured around the fact that we rely on the courts. And it's something of an iterative process, but one thing that really struck me in the book was the point that, business leaders don't want principles-based regulation, but they don't want it because they need the regulatory safe harbor. If they don't have that, then they are just constantly liable to an unlimited risk of going afoul of the regulators. Can we address that a bit? We've got a lawyer, some economists, someone who works with schools. Does anyone want to comment on that? I'm going to pick on you since you're the law professor.
I think it's very, very important to think about the role of courts, but we mustn't underestimate the role of administrative tribunals, administrative law judges, appeal tribunals within agencies, as well as the courts that play a sort of general backup purpose. One of the important things about the administrative agencies is that they have a degree of expertise in dealing on a repeat play basis with issues of this kind. When you move to the federal courts, you're moving to jack-of-all-trades amateurs who are appointed to the courts but are expected to be able to deal with any issue coming from any direction. So I would add that into the play, as well as the point about liability, which I think is tremendously important. One last point. There's been a lot of talk about accountability here, as though it were just a matter of naming and shaming. If accountability is not associated with very heavy sanctions, then given what's at stake in these regulatory issues, I think the prospect of this responsibility model is going to be quite forlorn.
Well, I'm afraid that we have 12 seconds left, and if anyone wants to take the last 12 seconds, no. This has been a terrific panel. I would like to thank all of our incredible panelists for taking time out of their busy days to join us.